You're marrying her? The horse doctor's daughter who smells like turpentine and sleeps in the barn?
The words cracked through the Calloway sitting room like a green log splitting in a fire. Every eye in that room landed on Reuben Holt as he stood beside Adelaide Marsh. Not the delicate, fair-haired Cecily everyone had spent 3 months preparing for, but her older sister, the one with iodine stains on her wrists and mud still drying on her boot heels. The one nobody had thought to mention in any of the letters that had passed between their fathers. Cecily's practiced smile stayed fixed on her face, but her eyes went somewhere cold and private. Their father, Harold Marsh, turned the color of a man who's just been told his best horse is dead. And Adelaide stood absolutely still, waiting for Reuben to say he'd been confused, that he'd meant the other one, that this was some awful mistake. He didn't say any of those things. Before any of them could breathe again, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what part of Canada you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. November in the Peace River country comes in hard and stays. Adelaide Marsh felt it through the gap in the barn door, where the hinge had never quite been repaired, the cold finding the back of her neck while she held a lantern steady and watched a mare try to decide whether to keep fighting or give up. The mare decided to keep fighting. Adelaide liked her for it.
She'd been awake since 3. That was nothing unusual.
Her father, Harold Marsh, ran a livestock operation on the eastern edge of the valley, cattle mostly, some horses he trained for surrounding farms, and one daughter, who understood animals the way other women understood embroidery, which was to say, completely without having been formally taught, because it was simply the only thing that made sense to her. The other daughter understood embroidery. Cecily was 24, 2 years younger than Adelaide, and she was the kind of beautiful that made men forget to finish their sentences. Their mother had died when Cecily was 3, and Harold Marsh had raised both girls according to a logic that seemed reasonable to him. Cecily was the one men would want, so Cecily should be made ready for wanting. Adelaide was the one who could work, so Adelaide should work. Nobody explained this arrangement out loud.
Nobody had to. Adelaide.
Her father's voice from the house, sharp enough to cut through the wind. Leave the mare, we have company coming tonight. She didn't answer. The mare wasn't done yet. By the time she came in through the kitchen door, boots trailing manure across the floor she'd scrubbed that morning, her father was already in the front room, adjusting a framed photograph that had been crooked for 11 years. Cecily stood at the window in a green wool dress that cost more than a month of feed bills, her hair done up in a style their neighbor Mrs. Fenwick had spent 2 hours arranging. The Holts are coming, Harold said without turning around.
I expect you to make yourself decent.
Adelaide looked at the clock.
She had 40 minutes. I'll wash up. Don't just wash up. Put on the blue dress. You look like a farmhand. She was a farmhand.
But she understood what he meant, and she understood why. Reuben Holt was the eldest son of Gideon Holt, who owned the largest spread in the region. 11,000 acres running north toward the timber and south to the river flats. The Holt operation had water rights, pasture that didn't flood, fences that didn't fall over. What it didn't have was an alliance with the Marsh family, whose eastern pastures abutted Holt land at a stretch that had been causing slow, grinding legal headaches for years. Harold Marsh had spent 3 months writing careful letters. The agreement being negotiated had nothing to do with Adelaide. She changed into the blue dress, which fit badly across the shoulders because it had been made for a younger version of her who'd done less physical work. She pulled her hair back, scrubbed the iodine off her wrists until the skin went pink, and came downstairs to find the Holts already in the front room. Gideon Holt was shorter than she'd expected, compact and watchful, with the kind of hands that had done real work once before the money grew large enough to hire the workout. He shook Harold's hand with the formality of men who've been negotiating for months and are tired of letters. His son Reuben was something else. Adelaide stood in the doorway taking him in before he noticed her. Tall, not quite as tall as the doorframe but close, with a face that had spent enough time outside to be permanently weathered into something honest. He wore a jacket that was probably his good one, but sat on him like something he'd borrowed, too stiff in the shoulders. He was laughing at something Cecily had just said, and the laugh didn't quite reach his eyes, which were doing what eyes do at a performance, watching without fully believing. Then he looked up and saw Adelaide standing in the doorway in her badly fitting dress, and something in his expression shifted. Not attraction. She was clear-eyed enough not to mistake it for that, more like recognition.
And who is this?
Gideon asked, with the tone of a man cataloging unexpected inventory.
Harold's shoulders went tight. My elder daughter, Adelaide.
She helps with the livestock.
Adelaide. Reuben said her name like he was testing its weight. Your father mentioned Cecily in his letters. Yes, Adelaide said.
Most people lead with Cecily. An uncomfortable pause moved through the room like a draft. Cecily's smile stayed on. Harold looked at Adelaide with the particular expression he reserved for when she'd said something true at the wrong moment. Gideon Holt's eyes traveled over her with professional detachment, the way he'd look at a horse he hadn't planned to purchase, but Reuben Holt kept watching her. The evening proceeded as planned. Cecily answered questions about her interests. She painted watercolors. She read novels. She could manage a household with quiet efficiency. Harold talked up the marshland, the cattle numbers, the potential of the eastern pasture once the boundary dispute was settled.
Gideon nodded and calculated. Adelaide poured tea and cleared plates and stayed at the edges of things, which was where she usually lived. Except every time she moved through the room, she felt Reuben's attention follow her. Not loudly, just steadily.
The way you watch something that doesn't quite fit the pattern you expected. Near the end of the evening, when the men were talking about fence lines, and Cecily was showing Gideon a watercolor she'd done of the river, Reuben appeared beside Adelaide near the sideboard where the cups were stacked.
You were in the barn when we arrived, he said quietly. She looked at him. For about 30 seconds she'd weighed whether to deny it. Yes. Breech birth?
Twins, actually. She paused. How did you know?
Your left sleeve. He nodded toward it. Iodine doesn't wash out fast enough to matter. She looked down.
There was a faint yellow-brown stripe above her wrist, right where her cuff had ridden up.
Did they make it? He asked. One did. The other one we lost. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you do this regularly? The veterinary work? It's not formal.
I know animals. I've always known them.
Our local vet is 70 miles out.
He nodded. He looked like a man filing information away carefully. Before they left, Reuben turned back from the door. Miss Marsh?
Adelaide. I'd like to see the eastern pasture tomorrow morning if your father agrees. The boundary, I mean. It would help me understand the dispute. Harold's face arranged itself into something welcoming. Of course. Cecily would be. I'd like Adelaide to show me, Reuben said. If she's the one who works that land, she'll know it better than anyone. The door closed behind the Holts. The front room detonated. What in God's name was that?
Harold's voice had gone tight and low, which was worse than loud. He came here for Cecily.
He came to look at land, Adelaide said. I know the land. You know what he came for, and you standing there in that ruined dressmaking comments. I made one comment. You embarrassed this family. Adelaide set down the cups she was still holding. I poured tea and answered a question honestly. If that's embarrassing, then we have different definitions. Harold turned on Cecily.
Did you see how he kept looking at her?
Cecily's face was smooth as river ice. He was curious. That's all. She's unusual.
Men look at unusual things, but there was something underneath the smoothness, something Adelaide caught and didn't examine too closely. That night, in her narrow room above the tack shed that she'd been sleeping in since she was 15, because the smells from the barn soothed her, Adelaide lay awake with the wind coming off the flatlands and thought about a man who noticed iodine stains. It didn't mean anything. She told herself this in a reasonable tone. Men like Reuben Holt didn't make decisions based on iodine stains. They made decisions based on land and money and alliances and the kind of wives who could host dinners without apologizing for their sleeve. She was not that kind of wife. She had never been groomed to be anything. She went to sleep deciding it didn't matter. He arrived the next morning on a solid black horse that moved like it had been trained with patience rather than force. Adelaide noticed this first, before she noticed anything else. It told her something about him. They rode out to the eastern pasture in the thin November light,
Adelaide on her mare Thistle. Reuben on the black he called Dutch.
She showed him the fence line, where it sagged, where it had been repaired badly, where the disputed strip of land ran along the creek bed that both families claimed. She spoke plainly. No performance, no softening. Just the facts of the land as she'd learned them over years of walking fence with the hands and checking cattle and knowing every wet patch and rocky rise. He listened without interrupting. She found this notable. When they stopped at the creek, he dismounted and crouched near the waterline, reading the banks. He had the habit of men who'd learned things through observation rather than instruction. The legal agreement your father wants, he said finally. It would tie these properties together through marriage.
Adelaide's jaw tightened. Yes. And you think it should be Cecily. I think that's what was agreed. He stood, brushing creek mud off his knee.
What do you think of agreements you weren't part of making?
She looked at him steadily. I think they tend to leave someone out.
He smiled.
Not the polished social version from the night before.
Something smaller and more real. They rode back mostly in silence, which Adelaide found comfortable rather than awkward. When they reached the barn, she dismounted and started unsaddling Thistle, not waiting for ceremony.
You've been doing this your whole life, he said.
Running the actual operation.
Someone had to. Does it bother you that it's been you? She thought about the question. Not the running of it, the invisibility of it, sometimes.
He was quiet for a long moment. Then, I'm not looking for a decoration. She stopped with her hands on the saddle.
Mr. Holt, Reuben. She didn't use his name. There are things you should understand before you say anything further. Cecily is warm and capable, and she would manage your household without complaint. She would be a credit to your family at every function that matters to your father. She is everything your father's letters negotiated for, and I've spent most of my life making sure the machinery that lets her be those things actually functions. She said it clearly, without bitterness, like reading from a ledger. That's the arrangement. I'm not in it. He looked at her for a long time. What if I want to change the arrangement? Then you're creating a problem that will hurt people I care about. He nodded slowly, like she'd told him something useful. I'll think about that. That evening, the Holts came to dinner. The meal was formal, more elaborate than the Marsh household had produced in years. Harold had spent money they didn't have on it. Cecily wore different dress, the pale one, and she was luminous in the lamplight. Gideon Holt seemed satisfied with what he saw. Adelaide had been told to eat in the kitchen. She was halfway through a plate of leftovers when her father appeared in the doorway, looking like a man who'd stepped on something in the dark. Front room, he said. Now. Reuben stood in the center of the sitting room with his chin up, his father to one side with the face of a man assembling patience from limited materials. Cecily stood by the window, her back to the room. Harold turned to Reuben. Tell her yourself. Reuben looked at Adelaide directly. I've told both our fathers that I'm asking for your hand. Not Cecily's. Yours. The floor dropped away. You're choosing her? Harold's voice climbed toward something unhinged. The one who smells like turpentine? Who sleeps above the barn? Who has never once in her life? Who has kept this operation running for the last decade, Reuben said, with a quietness that was more forceful than volume, while everyone else was busy being presentable. This is not what we agreed, Gideon said. He looked at his son with the flat anger of a man accustomed to compliance. We discussed this. Cecily Marsh. The arrangement was, I'm 31 years old, Reuben said. I've made 4 business arrangements in this valley already, and every single one of them started in a room exactly like this one. His voice was steady. I'm not making another one. Cecily turned from the window. Her face was composed in a way that cost something. If that's what Reuben wants. It's not what anyone planned, Harold said. He turned to Adelaide with the particular desperation of a man watching his scheme slide off the table. Tell him. Tell him the arrangement was for Cecily. Adelaide stood in the middle of that room with her badly fitted dress and her iodine wrists and thought about 26 years of making herself useful and making herself small so the useful part wouldn't offend anyone. She thought about Cecily's face going smooth as river ice. No, Adelaide said. Harold stared. What? I won't tell him that. Her voice was steadier than she expected. If he wants to ask me, I accept. The room went very quiet. Gideon pulled on his coat and picked up his hat. He didn't look at anyone. You've made your choice, he said to Reuben. Don't ask me to support the consequences. He left. The door didn't slam, which was somehow worse. Harold turned on Adelaide with something in his eyes that she'd only seen once before, when he'd lost a breeding bull to a fence malfunction. I want you out of this house. Tonight, Richard, Cecily started. Don't. He didn't look at her. I have nothing further to say to either of you. Reuben was beside Adelaide before she'd registered he'd moved. Can you be ready in an hour? She thought about her room above the tack shed, her kit, her notebooks, the small things she'd accumulated, the mare she'd raised from a foal. Most of it felt like she'd been borrowing it anyway. She was ready in 20 minutes. They rode out in the dark, Adelaide on Thistle, Reuben on Dutch. The cold was absolute and clean. Behind her, the Marsh house glowed in its windows like something she'd been pressing her nose against her whole life, never inside the warmth. She didn't look back. The Holt property rose out of the dark gradually. First the smell of it, cattle and cut timber and wood smoke. Then the lights, more than she'd expected, laid out across the valley floor like a small town that had decided to become a farm. My father will be here, Reuben said. I assumed. He won't make this simple. I wasn't expecting simple. Gideon Holt was in the main house in the sitting room with a whiskey, and an expression like a man who had decided to witness a disaster rather than prevent it. He looked Adelaide over once. You understand, he said, that this was not the arrangement. I understand that very clearly, Adelaide said. I wasn't part of the one that was made. Gideon turned to Reuben. The Marsh alliance is gone now. Harold will be furious. The eastern pasture dispute won't settle itself. There are other ways to settle a boundary dispute. Name one. Adelaide spoke before she'd decided to. Talk to the Marshes about a water management agreement. The creek doesn't care whose name is on the title. If both sides agree on seasonal access and maintenance responsibilities, the legal dispute becomes irrelevant. Gideon looked at her like she'd produced something unexpected from her pocket. The survey's old, Adelaide continued. Nobody's actually walked the line in 14 years. There may not even be a real dispute, just 2 families' assumptions about where a line is. She paused. That's fixable without a marriage or a court. Gideon was quiet. He didn't say she was wrong. He didn't say she was right.
He said, Maria will show you to a room. We'll discuss this further when I've had time to think. The room Maria showed her to was bigger than the tack shed by a factor that made Adelaide briefly lightheaded. She sat on the edge of the bed in her coat and boots for 10 minutes, not touching anything, waiting for the feeling of wrongness to pass. It didn't pass, but she stopped waiting for it till the next morning she was up before 5, which seemed to surprise the ranch hands considerably. By the time Reuben came looking for her at 7, she was in the cattle barn discussing the feeding rotation with the lead hand, a quiet man named Ferris who'd been doing this job for 20 years and had the particular wariness of someone who'd watched too many bosses' women play at ranching. He watched her for 3 days before he stopped being wary. She worked. She didn't perform working. She actually did it, because she didn't know another way to be.
She read the land the way she'd read the marsh pastures, understanding its patterns, its weak points, the places where the system was held together with the ranching equivalent of baling wire. Gideon watched all of it. He didn't comment. He didn't soften.
But he stopped leaving rooms when she entered them. 2 weeks after she arrived, a letter came from Cecily. She found Adelaide in the barn, delivered through Maria. Adelaide read it twice, standing in the cold with the cattle shifting and breathing around her. Cecily wrote without preamble, Father has arranged another match. A man called Barnett from Fort Vermilion, with money from the timber industry and the approximate warmth of a January morning. She's been told she should be grateful. She's been told this is what she was prepared for. She ended with, I don't know what I'm asking. I just needed to tell someone who might understand what it's like to be something someone else planned.
Adelaide stood there for a long time. Then she went to find Reuben. I need you to do something, she said. He looked up from the ledger he'd been reviewing. That's a tone I recognize. My sister needs to get out of my father's house. He set the ledger down.
Tell me, she told him.
When she finished, he said, she can come here. Your father will. I'll handle my father. He's already barely tolerating me. He's tolerating you more than you realize.
Reuben's mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile.
Yesterday he asked Ferris what you thought about moving the yearlings to the south pasture early. Adelaide stared. He asked Ferris. He wouldn't ask you directly, not yet, but he's asking. She let that settle. Then Cecily can come? She can come. Cecily arrived 4 days later.
In a buggy she'd hired herself with money she'd put away over 3 years in small amounts that their father hadn't tracked. She sat in the seat with her good coat and her watercolor set, and the expression of someone who has jumped from something high and is still deciding whether the landing will be survivable. Adelaide met her in the yard. Cecily looked at her for a long moment.
You look different, she said. The same. No. Cecily shook her head.
You look like you live somewhere. The sitting room conversation with Gideon that followed was not pleasant.
He objected on the grounds of precedent, of reputation, of the chaos it would invite from Harold Marsh,
who would certainly view the presence of his daughter on Holt property as a provocation.
Adelaide let Reuben manage the first part. Then she said, Mr. Holt, I understand your concerns are practical. Let me be practical too.
Cecily keeps books. She can look at your household accounts and your payroll records and your cattle transaction ledgers, and she'll find things in 3 days that have been costing you money for years, because that's what she's good at, and nobody has ever bothered to let her be good at it.
Gideon looked at Cecily with the evaluating eye of a man who'd just been told an asset had been mislabeled. Let her prove it, Adelaide said. If she's useless, you've lost nothing. If she's not, you'll know. Cecily was not useless.
She found 3 billing errors in the feed supply accounts on her second day, found a payroll discrepancy on her fourth, and reorganized the cattle transaction records in such a way that Gideon could look at them without Ferris translating. By the end of the first week, Gideon had stopped referring to her as the sister and started calling her by her name. Harold Marsh arrived on a Tuesday, which was the day Adelaide had been half expecting him since Cecily came. He rode in looking diminished, smaller than she remembered, the bluster that had always made him seem larger than his actual size now visible for what it was, borrowed volume. He found Adelaide in the north pasture moving cattle with Ferris and pulled his horse alongside hers.
Where is she safe? Adelaide said. And staying.
You took her from me. Both of you she left.
Adelaide kept her eyes on the cattle, same as I did. Adults making choices you didn't plan for.
He moved his horse closer. His voice dropped to the register he used when he wanted to be frightening.
You've made enemies of your own family. You know that? I know you'll call it that. Barnett is pulling his offer for Cecily. When word gets out about where she's gone, she'll be unmarriageable. You'll have ruined her. Or she'll build something that doesn't depend on being marriageable.
Adelaide looked at him finally.
You built this entire life around having daughters you could arrange. We aren't arrangements, Dad. We're people. It took me 26 years to say that out loud, and I'm saying it now. Harold's jaw worked. Everything I did was for this family. Everything you did was for the idea of this family. Adelaide's voice stayed level. There's a difference.
He sat on his horse looking at her across 11 years of silence. The years she'd worked without credit, the years she'd stayed small so Cecily could shine, the years she'd told herself this was just how it worked. Get off my father's land, she said. It was the first time she'd claimed it, and don't come back unless you're willing to have a different kind of conversation. Harold Marsh rode away. She watched him go until the dust settled. Her hands were steady. She found Cecily on the porch of the main house that evening, a ledger open on her lap and a cup of tea going cold beside her.
He came, Cecily said. It wasn't a question. He came. What did you say? What needed saying?
Adelaide sat down beside her. You're not going to Fort Vermilion.
Cecily looked at her for a long time.
Adelaide, I didn't defend you. All those years he treated you like hired help and I benefited from it and I never once.
You survived, Adelaide said.
Same as I did, in the ways you knew how.
That's too generous. Maybe. She let that sit. But we're here now, both of us.
The boundary survey happened in late November on a day so cold that the creek had gone silent under a skin of ice. Both parties stood at the actual line, Reuben and Adelaide representing the Holts, with Harold Marsh present at Reuben's written invitation, which had been formal enough that refusal would have looked petty. The surveyor walked the line. The actual disputed section, when properly measured, turned out to be 60 feet of creek bank that neither party had ever genuinely used. 60 feet. 3 years of legal correspondence. Harold Marsh looked at the surveyor's notes and said nothing for a long moment.
There's a reasonable access agreement to be made here, Adelaide said. Seasonal water rights, shared maintenance, no exclusion for either side. She looked at her father. You don't need a marriage to settle this. You just need to agree. Harold looked at Reuben, then at Adelaide, then back at the frozen creek.
He signed the access agreement before they rode back. He didn't speak to Adelaide, but as he mounted his horse, he stopped with his back to her for a long moment. Your mother would have.
He started. He didn't finish it. He rode away. She didn't know what he'd meant to say. She thought maybe she didn't need to.
The investor meeting came in January, when 2 men from Edmonton arrived with money and questions, and the specific wariness of people who've read bad news about a family in correspondence. Gideon Holt met them in the main house with Reuben on one side and Adelaide on the other, which was the first time he had placed her deliberately in that configuration. One of the men, whose name was Drummond, leaned across the dinner table and asked Adelaide directly whether she thought the Holt operation was positioned to expand northward, given the timber rights situation. Adelaide looked at Gideon. He gave her a slight nod.
Not yet, she said.
The northern acquisition makes sense in 3 years, not now. The carrying capacity of the existing range hasn't been properly assessed since the expansion in '09. If you push north before you understand what the current range can actually support, you're borrowing against a calculation that might be wrong. Drummond looked at Gideon.
She's right, Gideon said. That's the revised plan. After they left,
Reuben found Adelaide in the barn checking on a horse that had been favoring its left front all week.
You didn't embarrass him, Reuben said.
I told the truth. He's not used to that being helpful. She didn't look up from the hoof she was examining. She'd found a small stone lodged near the frog, working it loose carefully with a pick.
He should get used to it. He's trying to.
She set the hoof down and stood and found Reuben watching her with the same expression she'd seen on the hillside back home, the first time she'd spoken plainly.
Something like relief. You know what Drummond said to me on the way out? Reuben said. She waited. He said, hold on to that one. She almost smiled. What did you say?
I said I intend to. The wedding took place in February, which in the Peace River country meant the ceremony happened inside, and the celebration happened around a fire in the yard that Ferris built large enough to be seen from the road. Cecily stood beside Adelaide in a coat rather than a bridesmaid's dress because February did not forgive ceremony. Gideon walked her to Reuben. He had not offered, she had not asked. But when the moment arrived, he appeared beside her and offered his arm with the stiff formality of a man doing something he's decided is right without being entirely comfortable about it. You're the most inconvenient person I've ever had to accommodate, he said quietly as they walked. I've been told that.
I would not have chosen this.
I know. He stopped. They were 6 feet from Reuben, who was watching them both. Gideon looked at Adelaide with the particular expression she'd learned to read on him.
The one that meant he was about to say something he'd never intended to say. Catherine, his wife,
her name had been, the woman in the photograph in his study. She would have liked you considerably, he said. She was inconvenient, too. He placed Adelaide's hand in Reuben's. That's the highest thing I know how to say. She let herself believe it was enough. The spring that came after that winter was the kind that feels earned. Green appearing in the folds of the hills before it came anywhere else, cattle pulling at grass that had strengthened over a winter left to rest. Adelaide walked the fence lines with Reuben in the early mornings, the same way she'd walked them her whole life, but differently now, because now when she identified a problem, it went on a list that someone acted on. Cecily had taken over the full accounting operation by March. Gideon had stopped pretending this wasn't happening and started giving her reports to review before he reviewed them himself. Adelaide found her sister one afternoon in the ranch office, ink on her fingers, deep in a column of figures, and sat down across from her without speaking. Cecily looked up after a moment.
You look settled. Still terrifying, Adelaide said. Just mine. Cecily set down her pen. I owe you something I don't have a word for. You don't owe me anything. I stayed quiet for years while he used you. That's a debt. Adelaide thought about this honestly. You were surviving the only way you knew how. So was I. We just knew different ways.
Yours took more courage. Mine took more desperation.
There's a difference.
Cecily looked out the window at the yard, where Ferris was directing two of the hands in a repair, the same kind of repair Adelaide had been doing since she was 16.
The same work, different hands doing it, paid wages. Is it strange? Cecily asked. Being seen? Adelaide thought about it. Every day, a little. A letter came from Harold Marsh in April, 1-page plain. It said the access agreement was working. The legal fees had stopped. He had hired 2 hands instead of relying on what he called, in his careful handwriting, unpaid family labor, which was as close as Harold Marsh was likely to come to calling it what it had been. He did not ask for anything. He did not apologize. He asked at the end whether Cecily was well.
Adelaide wrote back and said she was. She didn't add anything. Some gaps had to be crossed one plank at a time. In the summer, she learned she was pregnant. She told Reuben standing in the north pasture at the end of a long day, the light going gold over the hills, because that was where she happened to be, when she knew for certain.
He went very still the way he went still when something mattered. Then he said, I hope she has your hands. She might be a boy. Then I hope he has your hands.
She laughed. He pulled her in and she let him, and above them, the sky went from gold to the particular deep blue of a prairie evening that has decided to be generous. She thought about her mother who had died before Adelaide was old enough to ask her anything. She thought about Gideon's wife Catherine, inconvenient and beloved. She thought about the women who had come before her in the Peace River country, who had done necessary work without credit, who had kept operations running while their names went unrecorded in the ledgers. She thought, this will be different. Not perfect. Nothing was. The ranch would have hard years and the boundary agreement would have its complications and Gideon would remain. Until the end, a man who expressed affection through criticism and whose warmth was most visible in what he did rather than what he said. Cecily would fall in love with Ferris the following spring, which nobody had anticipated, and Harold Marsh would object and then eventually relent, because his daughters had become women who didn't require his permission.
But different, yes.
Built on something that could be seen clearly in daylight, that didn't require anyone to stay small to hold it together. The daughter they named Eleanor, for no particular reason except that it suited her from the first moment, grew up knowing the land the way her mother had known it. Instinctively, through the soles of her feet. She followed Adelaide on the fence lines before she was old enough to understand what fences were for. She sat in the ranch office with Aunt Cecily and learned that numbers could tell true stories if you were willing to read them carefully. Gideon died when Eleanor was 4, in his study in the evening, peacefully with a photograph of Catherine on the desk beside him and the accounts in order. Adelaide found him. She sat with him for a little while before she called anyone, in the particular quiet of a room where something large has just finished. She had never been certain that he loved her. She was certain that he respected her, and she'd come to understand that from Gideon Holt, that was the same declaration.
She told Eleanor the whole story when Eleanor was old enough.
About the sitting room in November and the iodine on the wrist and the 60 feet of disputed creek bank that had never mattered as much as the people standing beside it. She told her about the choices that looked like losses and turned out to be the only road to anywhere worth going.
Some things, Adelaide said, you don't get handed. You have to walk toward them in the dark and trust that the ground is there. Eleanor thought about this seriously in the way of children who are taking notes. What if the ground isn't there? She asked. Then you learn to build it, Adelaide said. That's the family business.
The fence lines stretched out in every direction from the house, marking land that had been earned honestly, negotiated fairly, built on something stronger than arrangement. The Peace River country spread north and west in the particular way of land that doesn't care what you plan for it. Enormous, patient, indifferent to ambition, faithful only to work. Adelaide Marsh Holt had learned to love that about it. The land didn't lie. It didn't perform.
It gave exactly what you put in, no more, no less, and if you paid attention long enough, it would teach you everything about what it meant to stay. She had stayed. She had been seen. She had built something.
That was more than enough. That was everything.